Okay, well, perhaps if we make a start, good morning, afternoon, or evening from Geneva to all of you. I hope this finds you well, and welcome to this UNIDIR event on the margins of the First Committee in New York. This event is going to focus on exploring prospects for missile verification. My name is James Revel. I'm the program lead for WMD and other strategic weapons here at UNIDIR, and I will be moderating this panel today. I should note before we proceed any further that this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the UNIDIR YouTube channel in due course. And the focus here will be to present UNIDIR's missile verification project. This project explores approaches to verifying various aspects of missile programs. This includes verifying the limits on mobile missiles, distinguishing nuclear-capable missiles from conventional ones, building remote verification tools, and verifying the peaceful nature of space launch programs. But before getting into that, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Thomas Göbel, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. He will be providing some introductory remarks to set the scene for the panel discussion. Thank you kindly for taking the time to join us, Ambassador, and the floor is yours, sir.
Yes, thank you, James, and good evening from Geneva, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted that the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs is able to actively support UNIDIR in exploring options for missile verification through this project. Missile technology plays an increasingly crucial role in arms developments, with a growing range of missions that missiles are able to carry out. They are gaining more and more significance for military arsenals and strategies. This gives rise to a number of issues, some mirroring known challenges from the past, and some entirely new. So firstly, we are currently witnessing what might be termed a revival of the missile arms race. Existing arms control regimes limiting such dynamics are under considerable strain. Upholding, let alone expanding, universalizing, or creating new arms control regimes becomes ever more difficult. In Europe, we were reminded of this fact by the demise of the INF Treaty, rendering the continent vulnerable to a renewed missile standoff. But this is a global issue. For example, in the Asia-Pacific region, we see a varying dynamic with ever-growing capabilities of different actors, in many cases unimpeded by arms-controlled regimes. Secondly, more and more modern missiles are possible means of delivery for weapons of mass destruction. The result is an uncertainty about the true number of nuclear-armed and conventional missiles, which heightens the risk of miscalculations. The ambiguity of dual-capable missiles also poses a challenge to existing missile verification mechanisms. A third challenge: new technologies, which are not yet reflected in existing agreements and treaties. Hypersonic missiles are just one example of such a new and potentially disruptive technology. The development of new and advanced technologies challenges the global strategic balance. Without regulation, these advancements will almost inevitably lead to a proliferation crisis. These new and largely unregulated technologies like hypersonics, artificial intelligence in weapon systems, laws, and space weapon systems therefore call for a new and vigorous effort to stabilize and possibly expand missile-related arms control. Investigating options to verify limits on deployed missiles is now more important than ever if we want to be prepared for a window of opportunity arising in missile-related arms control and disarmament talks. Appropriate verification tools are essential for arms control and disarmament efforts and will help to reduce the risks associated with missiles. An indispensable precondition for an effective arms control regime is an efficient toolbox for missile verification. The aforementioned challenges to arms control, such as an increase in dual capabilities of missiles, new technologies, and present-day proliferation crisis, intensify the need for efficient and effective verification instruments to be readily available. This includes both taking stock of the past, the status quo, and new tools of verification. This is where the value of this UNIDIR project lies. The verification instruments that are mapped, improved, and developed here will be a valuable resource when a window of opportunity for progress in missile-related arms control talks arises in the future. At the same time, discussions on verification are particularly helpful to create transparency, bridge gaps, and generate confidence. Confidence between states by working on practical, technical issues. All sides acknowledge the importance of verification, even if they differ substantially on specific issues of arms control and disarmament. Preparatory work for verification mechanisms must begin now, and conceptual and methodological issues must be addressed as well as technical aspects. I'm also delighted that insights from German initiatives such as the Missile Dialogue Initiative and the Capturing Technology Rethinking Arms Control Conference will be incorporated into this project. So finally, I'm looking forward to the preliminary results of the project as presented by Mr. Podvig, Mr. Stefanovic, and Mrs. Ortega, as well as the following discussions today. I hope that both will foster further engagement in missile verification. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for setting the scene and laying out some of the challenges, both old and new, that lie ahead. With that, I'd now like to jump straight into the panel and get into the toolbox that Ambassador Göbel referred to. The format for doing so today will be a moderator conversation followed by an audience Q&A. In order to make the best use of our time, we're going to request that participants use the Q&A function to submit written questions. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a little icon with Q&A if you'd like to put your questions in there. We will endeavour to get to as many questions as possible, but we make no guarantees as we do actually have a time limit for this event. So please apologies if we don't get to your question, but please, I would encourage you to submit questions, and please don't wait, please do submit them as they emerge to you. I should also note, importantly, that all panelists are speaking in their personal capacity. And I'd now like to introduce the three panelists that we have. Firstly, if I could introduce Dimitri Stefanovic. Dmitry is non-resident fellow at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. He has also written widely on topics of global security, strategic stability, nuclear weapons, and military applications of emerging technologies, as well as work around missiles and missile verification. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Dmitry. The second speaker I'd like to introduce is Almudena Ortega, who is an associate researcher in the WMD program here at UNIDIR. Her research focuses on space security and missiles. And again, I'm delighted you're able to join us here, Almudena. And finally, Pavel Podvig is a senior researcher at UNIDIR. He's also the lead researcher on the nuclear verification related research here at UNIDIR, and he's published widely on issues related to nuclear verification, arms control, and various other issues. Thank you all for taking the time to join us here. And with that, I'll start. So if we get straight into the discussion, and perhaps Pavel, we could begin with you giving us a brief outline of the project and laying out what you're trying to do, where this is going. Over to you, Pavel.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us today. And my special thanks to Ambassador Göbel for being here and giving us a very good introduction to the issue. I could only share the sentiment that we are in a situation regarding missiles that is getting quite complicated. It's already got pretty complicated. And there are many challenges that we are facing. In this project, we are taking an optimistic view. Some may say too optimistic, but nevertheless, we are looking at verification tools that would allow us to verify various future arms control agreements. And in fact, it is not unusual for states to start thinking about arms control exactly when the situation is turning to the worse. So maybe I hope that that gives us a bit of a silver lining in this situation. And of course, if the current trends are left unchecked, we will be facing many and multiple risks associated with development and deployment of all kinds of missiles, old and new. And to manage this risk, we will need to have new agreements, limits, and restraints. And we all know that for arms control agreements to work effectively, they should be effectively verifiable. At the same time, it also works the other way around in that the scope of what is possible and what we could think in terms of arms control to some extent depends on what it is that we can verify and what kind of limits we can be confident in maintaining. And the idea of the project is exactly in that, to look at various verification tools and as they apply to missiles, and see what we can or cannot do where we need more work. It's still work in progress, but we can report our preliminary findings as we are working on our report. In brief, the main conclusion that we have a fairly impressive toolbox already, and with some political will, we can do quite a bit to mitigate those risks related to missile development and deployment. But first of all, let me just say a word about how we define verification, because it is important. And the position that we take is that verification is an activity that helps states to make a judgment about compliance with certain obligations. Well, apparently the compliance of other parties of the agreement that in question. And the obligation part is very important because this is what distinguishes verification from activities like monitoring, or for that matter, this is what distinguishes verification from transparency and confidence building measures. Again, these are all valuable activities on their own, but monitoring does imply a look from an outside. And in transparency and confidence building, it's not necessarily that the transparent side, as welcome this gesture might be, the transparent side defines the limits of transparency on its own. So verification in that regard is a bit different, and it is precisely the value of verification as an activity. Another important point about verification is that we should keep in mind that it is virtually impossible to build a system that would provide an absolute assurance of the absence of any violation. It's never been done that way, and it is unlikely to ever be done in the future. What verification should do instead is to provide confidence in the absence of significant violations, or you could put it militarily significant if you are in this kind of situation. And that's what makes verification a more realistic project. And this is what should also be kept in mind, because what is significant and what is not is also, it's not necessarily a technical issue, it could be a political issue. And so a lot of these parameters are in the hands of states that are thinking about arms control. With that in mind, we focused on several specific issues in our project, and one conclusion that we reached is that there are quite a few tools that are out there already. The particularly useful is the US-Russian arms control process and the treaties that have been in force for many decades now. For example, one of the issues that we looked at, the missile range, and which is relevant to many situations, especially regional. If we look at that, and we have, it's not a trivial issue, and there are many ways to define the range, and there are many ways to, many problems that need to be solved. But the START Treaty, the US-Russian START Treaty that was concluded 30 years ago, actually included a very detailed procedure that helped define range of ballistic missiles, and it also included procedures like telemetry exchanges that would be crucial if there is an agreement on range. And this can be adapted, not directly used, but could be adapted to future agreements as well. If we're talking about range, things are a bit more difficult for cruise missiles, and you may remember the dispute about the INF Treaty, which to some extent that was exactly the issue. However, again, as we looked at these, our conclusion so far is that there is quite a bit that can be done there too, even though this verifying range of a cruise missile may require more intrusive procedures. Another issue that also came up in relation to potential limits on missiles is the limits on mobile missiles. And many of modern missiles are mobile, especially shorter range ones. And how do you verify those limits on numbers or areas of deployment, or because these are mobile missiles after all, they could move. And again, that's something that's been done in START and New START, and the tools that are available there include the on-site inspections, notifications, writing down serial numbers of missiles. So that experience will certainly be very helpful to new agreements as well. Since I mentioned the on-site inspections, among other tools, we all know that verification procedures could be quite intrusive, and that takes a certain will to implement intrusive measures like that. On the other hand, what we try to do is we looked at what can be done from a distance. We all know about the ubiquity of satellite imagery these days, and that was used to monitor all kinds of activities and related to missiles or others. The open source imagery, of course, is not something that states would necessarily use for their verification as their verification means. They would rely on their own national technical means. But the open source imagery shows that it is very difficult these days to hide any significant activity. Again, speaking of significant activities. More interestingly, and that was one conclusion, we looked at the other open source data, and these range from mainstream media reports to all kinds of social media posts. And you could conclude that, in fact, we are already in an environment that is fairly transparent for many purposes. And of course, it is difficult to imagine that states would use social media as their verification tool, but this transparency changes the background. It changes and makes states. It means that states may need less intrusive procedures to reach the same level of confidence in compliance as than that was the case in the past. And finally, space not only provides new national technical means or open source capabilities, space programs are also a source of technologies that, as we all know, is very relevant to missiles. And this is often considered a proliferation issue, and it is a proliferation issue, but we also look at it from the verification point of view. What are the options of verifying that a space launcher program does not have a military application? Assuming, of course, that a state would be willing to undertake an obligation of this kind. So, and to summarize, our work so far shows that quite a few things can be done. Some measures will require greater transparency and cooperation. Some, as I said, the things are changing in the direction that may not require very intrusive measures, but we have a good foundation of tools that have been developed in the past that we can build on. And we increasingly have a better and more capable technology. So I think that there is some reason for optimism, and we do hope that we could make a contribution to development of these tools and new approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. It's always good to have some grounds for optimism in these discussions. Your comments have already prompted some questions and points within the Q&A on domestic political challenges. I mean, there's also a question from your perspective, I think, on what you see as being the biggest challenge. And then also I'd have a personal interest in following up on open source imagery, but I think we'll get to that later. If I may now, though, could I turn to you, Almudena? And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the existing regimes and whether there are actually limits to missiles within those existing regimes, and talk to those points. The floor is yours, Almu.
Absolutely, thank you, Jamie. So, as for limits to on missiles, well, not really. Missile technology is not very constrained. Pavel talked a bit about certain limits that maybe countries bilaterally agree upon, like, for example, the New START treaty between Russia and the US. But this is precisely a bilateral treaty, and although it does contain a verification mechanism, it only binds those two countries. However, when it comes to multilateral mechanisms, there isn't really that much. We do have export control regimes. So there is, for example, the Wassenaar Arrangement or the Missile Technology Control Regime. But these are export control measures. They don't really impose limits on indigenous programs. And of course, there are no verification mechanisms there either. We can also look to non-binding mechanisms relating to missiles. These also exist. The HCOC is an example of this. However, the HCOC doesn't really prohibit the development of ballistic missiles. Firstly, because, well, it is a non-binding measure, hence it only issues recommendations or guidelines, but also because the focus of the HCOC is to encourage certain activities to promote the building of trust among states in the sense of TCBMs that Pavel was talking about. Examples of this can be sharing information on launches, on policies by states, etc. I think the closest thing to a ban on ballistic missiles by the HCOC would be the recommendation that the subscribing states exercise a maximum possible restraint in the development, the testing, the deployment of ballistic missiles capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction. But that is pretty much all there is.
Okay. Thank you, Amadena. You mentioned space launches and missiles, and I think that links to a question I'd like to actually put to you, Dmitry, if I may, which is, are there ways to verify that a space launch vehicle program, sorry, I should say, does not have a military application? But what are the options that we have available to us here? And the floor is yours, Dmitry.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for having me as a part of this project. Well, the easy answer is no, there is no way to verify that this or that technology is purely civilian for peaceful space exploration and not for development of ballistic missiles. But if we go into some details, then probably we will find ways to address it. First of all, we should understand that from the operational standpoint, basically what you need from a ballistic missile, from like a battle purpose missile, is different from what you need from a space launch vehicle. And this is probably where we can find some solutions. Obviously, for the battle missile, for the ballistic missile, you need to have it ready for launch for as long as possible, because you hardly will use it immediately after production. You need to have it at battle alert somewhere, and so on. For space launch vehicles, the more traditional thing is that those are fueled just before their mission, and that's all. So from the operational standpoint, there are differences. Also, to have like a proper battle system, you need to be very focused on the launch facilities, whether they're stationary, they should be protected, whether they are mobile, and again, they should be more or less concealable and still very capable. For space launch vehicle, it's easier than that, although there is a huge challenge of recent times is the investments by different space startups in the light launch vehicles and some temporary infrastructure that can support the launch facilities. Here, the similarities between battle systems and peaceful systems might make things harder to address. And of course, to have a truly battle system, one needs to test it as such, because no matter how confident you are in your simulations, in the characteristics you have achieved of different parts of the systems, for example, like the throw weight, the burnout speed, like all things like that of different parts, they might give you some confidence, but if you have never tested this or that system as actual weapon, for example, launching it or the desired range, checking how good it is in re-entering the atmosphere, how precise it is, then I can hardly imagine if any like military decision maker would be happy to use it as a weapon if he is not confident in its capabilities. So this is where there is some room for optimism. If we will be actually interested in fighting, in establishing a line between the two, then we should look at operational practices and in transparency. But these operational practices and sharing information about these operations, about tests, some pre-launch notifications, they require so-called cooperative environment, because if we are not interested in explaining that this is truly a peaceful program and this is a battle program and how to define the two, then it will be quite hard to enforce such a transparency mechanism. And one last point, which is we've just seen a bright example of how hard it is to distinguish between the two with this strange launch reported about the Chinese, who actually used a space launch vehicle which is based on a ballistic missile to test something that was either a battle system which can circle the Earth and then re-entry, or a reusable spacecraft. We don't know what it was. We don't have means to verify it is, and it basically shows how important the work we are doing here. And that I'll stop and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dmitry. Now, if I could perhaps turn to you again, Pavel, before going to one of the audience questions. You touched upon earlier that the long association that missiles have with the delivery of nuclear weapons. And I wonder, what can this sort of experience and what can this tell us from a verification perspective? What can we take from that experience there? And I'll hand that over to you, Pavel, before going to an audience question. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, this is also one of the issues we're looking into. It is true that missiles have long been, especially long-range missiles, have long been associated with weapons of mass destruction and nuclear specifically. But we can see that increasingly missiles are deployed as conventional missiles, and there is discussion about projects like Global Prom Strike and others that argue that missiles of intercontinental range could be conventional and still be useful militarily, which is a separate point. But it is true that at some point it might be useful and possible to have an agreement that we could imagine an agreement that could limit nuclear missiles, missiles that can carry nuclear warheads, but on the other hand, will allow conventional capabilities. And this is a difficult issue, and no questions about it. But again, our analysis shows that it is not an impossible challenge, and there are ways of actually distinguishing, separating nuclear capable missiles from non-nuclear capable. And there are ways of doing that. For example, even today, even in when we don't really have verification measures, we know examples where we can say with certainty that certain missiles are not nuclear. For example, my favorite is we know that the surface fleet of the United States does not carry nuclear weapons. So we can be certain about that, even though we've never really nobody had the chance to verifying that fact. It's just verification is more than just kind of a looking under the hood, if you will. There are other ways of separating nuclear and non-nuclear missiles as well. We can, if we look at operational practices, for example, we can see that in some states, warheads for missiles are stored in a separate storage facilities that are they're not really deployed on missiles if we're talking about shorter range missiles. And so if you could verify that those storage facilities don't contain nuclear warheads, then you could have a very good certainty that none of the missiles are deployed with nuclear warheads. And again, this is something that we've done in other verification projects at UNIDIR, and I am confident that there is a way of gaining enough confidence in nuclear capability of many missiles that are deployed. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Pavel. If I might turn to a question from the audience, and perhaps if I could put this firstly to Dmitry, to you first, and then perhaps to you as well, Pavel, and Almudena, of course, if you'd like to take this as well. But there's a question on whether we should retain the current classification of missile limitations based on ranges like ICBMs, IRBMs, or should we have a different type of classification method based on maneuverability? I just sort of be interested in one to put to you, and don't know whether, Dmitry, do you want to take that one first of all? If I could encourage you, please do send in your questions and we will try and get through those. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. That's a great question, and there's a lot of debate about it. I'd say that we definitely should retain the classification that is already in the document, in the active documents, like we need ICBM defined as a new start to keep things, well, manageable and limited between Russia and the US. But if we speak about probably some future arrangements, then indeed, probably old definitions are not that important. Actually, one example that I very much like is like we have had definitions in the INF Treaty, and then we've tried to use these definitions as by we I mean Russia and the US jointly back in the day, to use these definitions as a reason for other countries who possess similar capabilities to join the INF Treaty. But what was never discussed is that for these countries, the missions for these intermediate range weapons were purely strategic, and which was not the case, at least to some extent, with regard to the INF range weapons that were deployed in the 80s by the Soviet Union and by the US. So my point is that now it might be more important not to stick to the technical specifications, although those are important, but to the missions foreseen for this or that country, for this or that weapon. And it is not an easy task. It requires a lot of trust, a lot of transparency. But if we just stick to the ranges, no matter how good we are at defining those, it will not help us much to make a world a more safe place. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitry. Please, Pavel. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I want to support what Dmitry just said, and I would probably add that the definitions we should keep what we have. That's no questions about that. However, we should also keep in mind that the definitions that we have today, they are there mostly by an accident. And the reason we define ICBM as a missile with a range of more than 5,500 kilometers is because they decided that it's the distance between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the same was with the INF, the intermediate range missiles. I mean, there was just a category that kind of covered the missiles that people worried about at the time. I'm not sure that the maneuverability would be necessarily a good way of defining or replacing the categories. But my take would be that whatever works. So if we are concerned about a specific category of missiles and we can think of a way of limiting or banning them in a certain way, we should make up a new category for them if we have to. And so we should not be constrained by necessarily by the existing definitions, even though, as I said, I mean, to the extent they work, we should definitely keep them. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. I'm going to move now to take another question from the audience, if I may. Now, perhaps I can put this to you, Almudena. And the question that's just been submitted relates to, is there a mechanism via which launch operations into orbit, space in general, are to be verified and approved by a governing body? So is there space for that? Could you elaborate on that? Over to you, please, Almudena.
So I would say not really per se, or there is a registration convention that applies to outer space. Currently, around 70 member states have signed and ratified this convention, and this convention establishes that states that launch vehicles into space have to provide information both to the UN Secretary General, which has a registry for this purpose, and it also every state also has to have its own national register. the information, so that this registration convention establishes a set of details that states have to keep track of, which can aid for the purposes of verification, but there isn't really a approved by a governing body, so a method approved by a governing body that exists that applies internationally beyond that. The Outer Space Treaty also establishes some limitations on what can be launched into space. Specifically, what it prohibits is the stationing in space and the placement in orbit, as well as the installation in celestial bodies of nuclear weapons, as well as weapons of mass destruction. But beyond that, so that is something that could be used for the purposes of verification, perhaps, but beyond that, there isn't really much.
Thank you. If I could just unmute myself. Thank you. Thanks, Almudena. Perhaps now if I can turn to you, Dmitry. Issues of maneuverability were raised before, and I'm slightly hesitant with this following your Twitter feed at some point to raise the issue of hypersonics, but I wonder whether you could comment on the various advanced systems, hypersonic gliders, hypersonic cruise missiles, other systems that are in the news these days, and are there any specific verification challenges there? And this kind of ties in with the question actually in the chat, but please, over to you, Dmitry.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think that it depends on what we're trying to verify. Do we want to have like a full transparency about the missile arsenal of each and every country, or shall we look for like transparency on each and every transfer of each and every sub-technology? Those are, or should we just look for a mechanism that will make things more manageable? So we'll have like a rather high level understanding of the capabilities and of the investments of this or that country. Because in the end, well, the missile is a missile. It have like regular parts, regular fuels, guidance systems that are might be different given the flight, the trajectories, the speeds, and so on. But in the end, like these separate parts can be monitored, can be verified, and so on. As I've said earlier, what really matters is the cooperative environment, because if you want to conceal something, or if you want to establish like some surprise capability, it would be quite hard to prevent one from that. And like North Korea and Iran are great examples. Like they develop rather sophisticated weapons, and it's quite hard to prevent them from doing it. At the same time, if we establish an environment in which it would be better for them to be more transparent about these capabilities and about these intentions, then probably we might reach a safer situation. Like, I hope I've answered the question, but that's my main point.
Right. Thank you, Dmitry. If I can turn to Almudena now and actually put a question which also ties into something we have in the chat. It's really a question of are there any of the existing mechanisms that we have in place, particularly multilateral ones, are they fit for the purpose of verification? And this ties into some of the questions which is in the chat about do we need a multilateral treaty to invest on a verification body? Could a verification body of sorts be established through a prior multilateral agreement? And the example here given by the participant in their question is thinking of the CTBTO's success with on-site inspections. Perhaps if you want to take the first bit of that, then I'll open that to Pavel and to you, Dmitry, as well, if with your indulgence. But Alma, please, the floor's yours.
Absolutely, thank you. So as for whether there are any existing mechanisms which would be good for the purposes of verification, I believe that was the first part of the question. Well, as I said before, there aren't many limitations on missiles, and so as a consequence of that, there aren't really mechanisms of verification. However, when it comes to the multilateral scene, at least. However, I think that maybe the Hague Code of Conduct is probably the closest mechanism to this, or at least it could eventually lead to verification. Why is this? Well, the Hague Code, what it does is it encourages subscribing states to respect an obligation that space launch vehicle programs should not be used for the purposes of concealing ballistic missile programs. This is voluntary. It's true that the HCOG is not a treaty, so technically speaking, there is no verification here, but it is a commitment that could, in principle, be verified. And although the HCOG doesn't really explicitly cover monitoring and verification, it does foster the establishment of confidence building measures among states, which focus on the sharing of information. I think I mentioned before annual sharing of ballistic missile and space launch vehicle policies, number of launches annually, exchange of things like pre-launch notifications. So the exchange of these sorts of information can facilitate monitoring activities. And also the fact that it is a multilateral mechanism, which currently has around 140 subscribing states, is a good tool for this purpose, because it encourages, one of the things that the HCOG does is that it encourages states to also sign and ratify other existing multilateral treaties, in this case binding treaties, particularly those relating to space, like the Space Treaty. And although the UN space treaties do not really contain verification mechanisms for the purposes of missiles either, commitments to those agreements could actually aid in making verification an easier process, a more feasible process.
Thank you, Armin. Perhaps I can put that question, and perhaps if I could begin with you, Pavel, then I'll turn to you, Dmitry. But can a verification body of some sorts be established prior to multilateral agreement? Yeah, please, Pavel.
Well, yes and no. I would echo what Almudena said in that there are mechanisms that we could use today that could lead us to verification, and I think we had a discussion. For example, the HCOG that Almudena mentioned, it does not. It's a totally voluntary mechanism. On the other hand, in my view, nothing would prevent the subscribing states, or one state for that matter, to assume voluntarily and unilaterally assume certain obligations regarding its program, space program. For example, a state would want to demonstrate that its space program doesn't have military applications, and in principle, you could build a mechanism within HCOG probably that would verify that obligation. That will be an obligation without the treaty, but it will still be obligation, and technically it would be verification. And that's I think the important part here, and this is, I also want to touch on one of the questions in the chat about the politics of that, and attempts of various legislatures political bodies, internal political bodies, to interfere with the process. I think one important issue with verification is that it's not really a mechanism that is designed, or whose primary purpose is to find violations. I mean, that's not actually the case, because again, as I mentioned, there is no mechanism that could find all and every violation. No, we should probably think about verification as a set of measures that would allow states to demonstrate, to prove their compliance with the obligations that they undertake. And that's not a small thing. And this is actually how it worked with arms control, the US-Russian arms control, or back to US-Soviet. the willingness to cooperate with verification processes and procedures, the willingness to contribute to a resolution of dispute is in itself a very important part of your compliance record. And this is how you build confidence of other states in your compliance. And I think this is also, we should also understand that this is again, verification is fundamentally a political process. It's a judgment about compliance. As a judgment, it does involve a lot of room for political maneuver. And if you want to kill a certain treaty, you could do that by applying very strong standards. If you are confident enough to let certain issues resolve certain issues, you could do that again. But this is a very important part of the verification arrangements. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. And perhaps if I could put the same question to you, Dmitry, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, actually, I have like 2 points I would like to make about this verification thing. One is I entirely agree with Pavel that the main idea behind the whole stuff we are trying to define is to give discuss an instruments that states can use to prove that they're compliant. But on the other hand, as the CTBTO system was mentioned, I think it is also possible for some countries to establish some joint system that which will not be exactly verification, but more or less like monitoring of testing, like share data from early warning radars and things like that. In a perfect world, it should be like a multilateral effort with deployment of jointly operated radars somewhere where we discuss and the publicly available information, but we are not in a perfect world. Still, I believe it is something that worth considering and at least discussing, because one day it might become the only option to have at least more or less actual information about what this or that actor of international military political relations is doing. So yeah, this is my major idea. And also, it also relates to what was said in one questions in the Q&A box about the consequences of verification regime. Yes, probably we will not be able to do much if we find a violation, but even fighting this violation would be important because we will have a better awareness about what is going on. So this is also quite a result to focus an effort on. Yeah, and that I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Dmitry. Perhaps with your indulgence, if I could actually bring it back to the project just for one question and put this to you, Pavel. It seems we've gone through and we've heard quite a lot of challenges. As Ambassador Göbel pointed out earlier on, old and new challenges. I wonder, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge? What would we really need to overcome? I'll put that to you, Pavel. The floor's yours. Easy question.
Well, in a way, yes, because the biggest challenge is, in fact, is not in the verification proper. So it's kind of outside of our scope. But it is important to keep that in mind because as I mentioned earlier, there is the primary, in my view, the primary purpose of the verification mechanisms is to give all parties to a way to demonstrate their compliance, and the way to have them be compliant with the arrangement, with the regime, the only way to do that is to make sure that that agreement, that obligation that they assume, that they understand this obligation is in their interest. So, and this is again, this is what we've seen. The strongest arms control regimes were built exactly this way. If states believe that an agreement is in their interest, then they would be interested in maintaining that agreement, and they would be interested in being compliant and demonstrating through all possible verification measures that they are in compliance. Once states start having doubts or questions about their investment in a certain agreement, as we have seen, unfortunately, too many times in the past several years, or we can go actually to 20 years, to the end of the ABM Treaty, when a state believes that it is not, the agreement is not in its interest, ideally it would just leave the treaty, as normally a treaty provides this option, or it could start finding ways around the treaty, and that could lead to accusations, disputes, and in the adversarial situation, these disputes are normally left unresolved, and we have the same result, an agreement and the treaty collapses. So I think that that's the most difficult part in this equation, finding a way to reconcile the interests, finding a balance between have everyone invested in a treaty. But as I said, one of our listeners was exactly correct that it's then you still have to provide a mechanism to verify, because your agreement has to withstand the attacks of skeptics. You have to demonstrate that you can do what you promised to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. I have another question from the audience here, which I want to raise. I think this is perhaps best suited to you, Dmitry, if I may. The point here is that there are cases where missile stages are converted for use on space launch vehicles, and the example here is the Peacekeeper stage is converted to Minotaur rockets. But the question is, in such cases, how would the dismantlement of missiles be verified? Would any attempt to verify such action be too intrusive? And back to the points that Pavel was discussing earlier, would this be politically feasible? Please, Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's a good question, and I believe we have had cases like that in Russia-US agreements, especially with the INF Treaty, but also, yeah, with Peacekeeper missiles. And again, I might be wrong, but I have the impression that the states tend to agree to use those stages for all sorts of purposes, not only like space launch vehicles, but also to testing different payloads that might be intended for battle missiles, to test to use them as targets for missile defenses. And well, it is a challenge. It was one of the issues that Russia had with the US INF compliance, and for a good reason. So I believe in general, it's not what we are trying to address with this project. Probably Pavel will tell me that I'm wrong, but I have the impression that we are not about like verifiable disarmament and finding a mechanism how we will make sure that there are no more missiles anywhere for any purposes. Because in the end, if it was the case, then we will enter a situation where we will have some delivery systems developed from so-called commercial off-the-shelf systems, like we see with the loitering munitions developed by terrorists in Syria. So like if someone wants to have a weapon, he will find a way to have it. This is the main issue. So we look at the issue from another direction, how to make it possible for the ones who actually do not want to make a weapon to prove that they are not doing this stuff, and probably to well, at least try to affect the threat perception of the neighboring countries or from other countries on our planet, just to make things more manageable, more calm, more safe. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitry. I'm going to give you, Pavel, if you want to tell Dmitry he's wrong, then the floor is open if you want to. Otherwise, what I might suggest is moving on to a question, which is, I think, is also important to look at. It kind of gets after verification what question. And this suggests what are the consequences of a verification regime, and what could we do about treaty violations? I mean, that's a sort of a very difficult question to ask, but if anybody wants to take that, then the floor is open. I don't know, Pavel, do you want to have a go at that, or please, over to you.
Well, let me try. I sort of tried to answer that already and I do believe that it's very difficult, if possible at all, to come up with a strong what's the word? Enforcement measures in any treaties, and in fact, it may not, in my view, that may not be necessary. Again, if we have the key enforcement measure in any agreement is the interest of all parties in maintaining that, in reaching and maintaining that agreement. That's what should be the main goal. Having said that, I think from in the enforcement point of view, the one crucial element is the working dispute resolution mechanism and the willingness of parties to actually take it and use it, and it has to be adequate, because as I said, I mean, every verification system, every verification mechanism will inevitably come under political pressure, and we've seen that with START, with New START, with INF, we see it with NPT, the Chemical Weapon Convention, everything. And you have to have a system that works, that could actually that allows parties to bring evidence to demonstrate that they are in compliance, or to make a case about non-compliance. And in fact, that's the main element. Because what else can you do? Not much. Even we've seen that the enforcement is a very difficult issue. Thank
you. Indeed. Did anybody else want to take on that question, Amadena or Dmitry? No, perhaps I've always moved. There's a question here. I'm sorry if this may be a little bit poorly articulated, so apologies to the person that submitted it. But there's a question on related to weapons placed in orbit, and how would you go about? Is there scope for a sort of mock exercise in looking at verification, and is there a sort of tie to the treaty that you could actually base that upon? And I think that's probably for you, Amadena, and apologies for not doing the question justice.
Sure. Yes. So, as I said, the treaties that apply to, so that the UN space treaties say very little on space weapons. In fact, only Article 4 of the OSD mentions the placement of weapons in orbit at all, just to say that weapons of mass destruction, as well as nuclear weapons, which are weapons of mass destruction themselves, are prohibited and cannot be placed in orbit, stationed in space or installed in celestial bodies. Beyond that, it doesn't say anything about things like conventional weapons, for example. And the example that the person that submitted the question refers to, I believe, was the case of planetary defense. So what would happen if an asteroid were to come towards the Earth, and if we would be entitled to launch a nuclear weapon against that satellite? Would that be a violation of Article 4 of the OSD? Well, I think the issue here is related to the definition of what a weapon is, right? Would you consider a weapon, would you consider a nuclear artifact launched against an asteroid to save humankind from an asteroid that's coming towards you, like, Bruce Willis? Would that be considered a usable weapon, or would that be considered something else? I think at this stage, this is merely theoretical. There are other methods that planetary defense scientists explore, such as using gravity tractors to move the asteroid away from the trajectory towards the Earth, or other methods that I am not that well versed in. But when it comes to the legal side of things, the interpretation of the treaty, you would have to consider whether this fits the definition of a weapon that the drafters had in mind when they drafted Article 4 of the OST.
Pavel, did you want to follow up on that directly?
Yeah, just very quickly.
Okay, please.
I would just add, this is a good point about weapon. A weapon. This is why in places like FMCT, the Fissile Material Treaty, they use weapons and nuclear explosive devices. So there is a separate category for this thing.
And Dmitry, did you want to follow up on that as well? Please, the floor.
Yeah, well, I have seen a number of research articles and papers, including from Russian scientists, to use not only nuclear weapons, but also actual ICBMs as a delivery vehicle of this nuclear weapon to the asteroid, or probably not a nuclear, but kinetic vehicle. And I think that in such a situation, in such a scenario, it wouldn't be that much of a trouble. I think we will have enough ways to communicate intent on the one hand, and also on the other hand, no one will believe that someone wants to achieve some military superiority by using like 1 or 2 or 3 weapons. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thanks, Dmitry. There's a question here that's come in from the audience, which is actually directed towards Pavel, but I'm going to kind of exploit my position as moderator here and sort of answer it. The question is, other than space technologies, are there other emerging technologies that UNIDIR projects are looking at in terms of verification purposes? And examples here are given in terms of automation, blockchain, new sensors. I think collectively the answer to that would be yes, certainly. As part of the compliance and enforcement work, we had a report on investigative technologies, which we released, I think it was earlier this year. And then at the moment, we have work looking at specific aspects of verification technologies in relation to biological weapons. So there is quite a bit, and as well, colleagues are working in SecTech have produced a report on looking at the role of blockchain in relation to nuclear issues as well. So there is a lot going on, and I think we'd be happy to follow up on that or look at the website for further details. But also, I do want to give you the chance as well, Pavel, to answer it. It was directed towards you. Do you want to take that? And perhaps Almudena as well, if you want to talk about space tech. But Pavel, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's as Jamie said, I mean, across the institute, there is quite a bit of work on that. To some extent, we are looking at well, new sensors. Depends on how do you define those, I guess. But I would say that our project sort of looks at more old school issues, and so the practical issues that we had in mind when we launched it were specific challenges of verifying, for example, the ban on INF range missiles in Europe that Russia has suggested, which to some extent is not getting much traction because of the challenge of verification, sort of the range, how do you verify the range, and how do you deal with mobile missiles. So these are the issues. So we hope that we could kind of generate some discussion there and maybe bring some ideas on the table. Another possibility is that we there are ideas about the, speaking of the INF treaty, there are ideas about having what is called the nuclear INF, sort of to ban only nuclear missiles of the INF range. which we can discuss the sort of whether it's a good idea or not, but this brings you to the challenge of verifying nuclear and non-nuclear capability. So we already mentioned this whole issue of separating civilian space programs from military applications. So these are, and my take is that we have plenty of tools. If we stumble on something new, and we will definitely try to make a case that this is a useful tool for verification purposes. But we are looking mostly at kind of old school stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. I'm conscious of the time. We have about 4 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is offer all of the panelists the floor to provide some sort of final take-home points. I also note there is a question which has emerged in relation to underwater hypersonic systems. So if people want to take that, then please feel free to do so. But if I could perhaps start with you, Dmitry, last sort of concluding thoughts from you, please, the floor's yours.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll try to answer the question. Underwater hypersonic systems will be addressed by underwater hypersonic dolphins, especially trained. Yeah, but jokes aside, I believe that this discussion we've had and the whole project, and especially the introductory remarks from our German colleague, means that this is an issue we should deal with. We should find ways to address the challenge that missile development and rocket development provides us. I'm not trying to say that we're entering like some entirely different world or so on. The missiles were there for decades and they are here, but we have more operators, we have more categories, these things are becoming more capable. We have, if we speak about space launch vehicles, we have non-state actors becoming heavily involved in that. And to establish at least, to develop at least some instruments to keep the things manageable is a crucial task. And I'm glad that UNIDIR decided to try to find solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitry. And perhaps if I can turn to you, Almudena, for some concluding thoughts. The floor's yours.
Sure. Well, let me just echo what Dmitry just said. I think this is definitely an important issue. It is definitely a challenge, which is why I think UNIDIR and led by Pavel has taken on, trying to find a solution to this challenge. And even though things might not seem very clear, or they might seem even kind of bleak, we can see that that there are mechanisms that point to the possibility of verification for these types of technology, and I'm very happy to be part of this project and help Pavel discover the possible solutions that we can apply to it.
And final word to you, Pavel, please.
Yeah, and just very briefly, thank you for the very kind words. And again, thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, my final word would be, I'll try to be an optimist, and I know that this is actually fully warranted. We can do this. The verification is largely a political issue, and as long as it is understood like that, we are perfectly capable of developing technical solutions that would support political decisions. We have the experience, we have the tools, we know what to do. It's all doable. Thank you.
That's a great way to conclude, Pavel. Thank you. If I could just express my thanks to all of you three for joining us, for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to moderate this panel, so thank you to all of you. Thank you also to the UNIDIR team who do the production on this event. Often there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in order to bring something like this together. So thank you particularly to Maria Garzon-Maceda and Elena Krabil for the support here. And also thank you to all those of you in the audience that have joined this event and for the many questions. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, so thank you for that. You will receive an email from the UNIDIR team in due course in which we'll request your feedback. Alternatively, we welcome feedback through, there should be a link emerging in the chat window there just popped up. If we could encourage you to provide us feedback, it does help us to build and develop our events moving forward, so we do appreciate that. One final thing I'd like to draw your attention to, that we do have other UNIDIR side events in the first committee. There's more information on our webpage. And I would encourage you, please do explore the various publications from the verification workstream and indeed others on the UNIDIR website. And with that, I'll say thank you, have a good day or good night, wherever you may be, and thank you very much for joining us.